This machine is beyond saving. The wrench hit the concrete with a sound like a verdict. The yard fell into a taut, stunned silence. For a long second, the only thing moving was a thin ribbon of oil crawling down the bus's rusted flank, as if even the metal were trying to slide away from the pronouncement. The bus sat propped on blocks beneath a tarpaulin that had seen better storms. It was a hulking thing, once municipal and loud, now a stomach of silence. Panels were bowed, windows fogged with age, and the engine bay was a dark throat full of seized parts and decades of neglect. To the chief mechanic, it was a line item he had fought for and lost. He was a big man with hands that had learned to talk in grunts and shorthand, a man who measured worth by whether a boat moved or not. His jacket smelled of diesel and winter. He stood with his back to the workshop's open bay, the light cutting him into a silhouette of elbows and stubbornness. "It's not just old," he said, low enough that the others had to lean in to hear. "It's eaten through. The frame's shot. The transmission's locked. We pump money into this, and it gives us a bill in return." Beside him, Marco, who'd been on the crew longer than anyone and who carried mistrust like a pocket knife, snorted. "You keep saying try one more thing, boss. One more thing and the budget will try to take our heads off." Voices lined up with the facts. The new fleet manager wanted predictable numbers. The city wanted fixed schedules, not redemption stories. Even the apprentices, different faces and crowded mouths, had stopped hoping. They were tired of miracles that bled the shop dry. But the bus had a stubbornness of its own. You could see it in the scuffs on its steps, the faded sticker on the dash, Route 21, North Side. Someone had loved this bus enough to put that sticker there. That was the only thing in the yard that refused to let the bus be only a machine. It hung somewhere in the chief's line of sight like a soft accusation. A boy watched from the fence line, partly hidden behind a pallet of tires and a heap of discarded wipers. He had been watching for a while, moving like a shadow with pockets and a patchwork jacket. In his arms, a crumpled paper bag. Inside, a sandwich wrapped in wax paper and a small scrap of cloth knotted like a charm. He was the sort of person the shop was used to seeing, present, invisible. He knew how to stay quiet. He also knew things about metal that most people assumed only formal training could teach. He learned in different ways, by necessity, by saving a bicycle's wheel at night so he could ride somewhere tomorrow, by making a dart of tin to stop a leak under a rain-slate roof, by prying off a hinge with a pocket knife when the hinges were the only thing standing between him and shelter. His hands had calluses that told stories he rarely told. He kept his distance as the chief pronounced the bus beyond saving. The word beyond hung bigger than the boy's breath. But then, like every human who believes smallness can still matter, he edged forward until a boot end caught on a rag and he straightened, forcing his face into a casual pose. "Sir," he said, voice thin but steady, "you might not be losing the whole thing." The men turned, reflexive, half amused. A city kid, or maybe a runaway, who could tell, had spoken up. Marco's laugh cracked. "You got a degree on that sandwich, kid?" The boy didn't flinch. He opened his paper bag and offered it with two careful hands. Inside, the sandwich was nothing fancy, a thick slice of bread with a smear of something dried and sweet, olives mashed with onions, maybe. He held it out like the only offering that mattered. "It's all I have, but there's a hinge behind panel C. It's rusted where the bracket meets the frame, but if you tap here and clear the bracket, the linkage will free. It's not the transmission, sir. If the linkage moves, the engine might turn over. You don't need new parts. You just need to get it loose." There was a silence that wasn't waiting for permission, but waiting for everyone to process that the world had rearranged itself around a small, specific piece of information. The chief's jaw tightened. He had been a man who trusted experience, who respected proof. The boy's words were both a marker of labor and a claim of competence. "You sure you know what you're talking about?" the chief asked. It was a question that could be thrown away, but he asked it with his hands already closed into the memory of tools. "I fixed my friend's cart once. We were pushing for the market and the axle got stuck. We used a wedge and a hammer. Same idea. Knock the bracket free, loosen the link, and the gears can spin. It's not pretty, but it's honest." Marco barked a laugh that was more defense than humor. Honest doesn't pay the parts bill. But the chief was looking at the bus, at the stubbornness of the sticker, and something in him loosened. He remembered a bus he'd fixed 20 years ago that had been thrown out as junk and later kept 3 neighborhoods alive. He remembered the pride when a machine refused to die under his hands. Pride is a dangerous kind of nostalgia. It will make you hoard mistakes. But grief and pride are 2 sides of a coin. The grief for letting something go, like the finality of a sentence. "Hold the sandwich if you want," the chief said, the words rough as gravel. "But if you're right about panel C, get that wedge ready." The boy's shoulders gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He shuffled closer and slipped under the tarpaulin as if he belonged there by right. His hands were small. They smelled faintly of yesterday's smoke and soap used carefully. He reached into the engine bay while the men watched, as if to be invisible and impossible at the same time. He had no tools that matched the crew's, no hydraulic press, no torque wrench. He had a bar of a kind you could get by straightening a coat hanger and thickening it with patience. He threaded it into the crevice, felt for the bracket, and tapped, measured, precise, like a finger finding a pulse. The chief moved to the other side and squinted down the engine's spine, feeling the same stubbornness in his bones. "Give me a boost," the boy muttered. The chief handed over a wedge without thinking. The scrap metal bit into the rust, and the wedge gave a small complaining groan. 1 knock, 2 taps, a grunt. Metal shrieked through rust, a sound like small surrender. The linkage shuddered. There was an intake of breath from a man who had decided to call the whole thing dead only minutes before. The chief's hands were blackened with work and surprise. He looked at the boy, really looked, for the first time, at how he worked like the world was one wide, complicated lock, and every day you found a new key. "That was close," Marco said, but the edge in his voice had lost something. He stepped forward, then stopped, because the scene looked like a small theft of dignity being returned. He kept his distance. There was a lesson in how men stand when they are told they were wrong and must now watch the remedy. "Get us a battery on a charger," the chief ordered, voice brittle with a decision that had just been birthed and was still raw. "Let's see if it turns." The shop moved into practiced choreography. Someone dragged a battery cart. Someone else cleared oil rags from the floor. The apprentices hovered like helpers in a ritual too big for them. The boy stayed under the hood, knuckles slick, breathing measured. When the starter bit, it coughed again, and for one heart-stopping moment the engine whispered, then died. The second try made it cough like a recovering animal. The third turned it over long enough that an embarrassed cheer thrummed through the bay. It wasn't running, far from it, but it gave a sound that for a man like the chief was a promise. The chief's arms went suddenly heavy. He didn't know what to call the feeling. Relief? Guilt? A recognition that someone he'd not seen yet had been right. People fall in love with the idea of being needed. Mechanics fall in love with movement. The bus moved a little, and that little movement hit the chief harder than he would admit. He wiped his hands on a rag and looked at the boy. Up close, the boy was thinner than his jacket suggested. There were freckles across the bridge of his nose, and a faded bandana tied around one wrist. He smelled of smoke and bread. His eyes were steady, like someone who had watched a lot. "You okay?" the chief asked, the question less about the boy and more about the fact that he had been wrong and was now in the uncomfortable business of being grateful. The boy blinked. "I'm fine," he said. His voice was steady, and for a moment the chief saw no neediness in him, only competence and a tired calm. The boy clutched his sandwich, now slightly flattened but whole, and there was a firmness in the way he handled it, as if he'd promised himself to do more with less. There's always a pause when a person who has been invisible becomes visible. It creates a space that hums with possibility and danger at once. Possibility because someone might care, danger because now that someone sees you, they may decide you are worth nothing after all. The chief did something neither he nor anyone watching expected. He folded his own sandwich, a coffee-stained roll, from his jacket and broke it in half. The gesture was simple, almost clumsy. He held it out, an old man offering a truce. The young accepted without ceremony. They ate in a circle of men who had stopped asking permission to wonder. Food has a way of being a ledger between people. A shared bite is an unspoken contract. The boy chewed slowly, as if each mouthful kept a promise he could barter later. The chief watched him, the way an old craftsman watches new hands work with better steadiness than beginners deserve. If the chief had been expecting a show of gratitude, he was not disappointed, but not for reasons of vanity. The boy's thanks was practical. "I can come back," he said between bites. "I can look at the rest. I don't need pay, not now, but I know how to coax old things. I learned from an uncle. He taught me to listen to engines. They tell you what hurts." "Where'd you learn to work like that?" an apprentice asked, curiosity softening his features. "On the street," the boy answered plainly, "fixin' things to get by, helping at a garage sometimes. I'm fast." He gave a small, almost shy grin that acknowledged what he'd just said sounded like a claim. The chief studied him, the way his fingers moved, the blunt honesty of his speech, the absence of self-pity. There was a raw, practical courage in that, one the chief recognized as kin to his own stubbornness. It made him uncomfortably proud. He found his mouth saying something he hadn't rehearsed. "Tomorrow, 6 in the morning, you and me. We'll see what else is wrong." The boy looked up, eyes widening. Promise is a strange wage to offer a person who has learned not to trust leases. "I'll be here," he said. The chief noticed the way the promise settled in his shoulders, like something heavy finally placed in the right pocket. Before dawn the next day, the yard smelled different, a shift of purpose. The men still argued about invoices and whether the bus was worth the hours. They still kept their cleverness at the pointy end of skepticism. But under the tarp, the bus had a heartbeat, and someone had made a small bet on it, a bet that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with stubbornness.
There is a particular kind of hope that arrives not all at once, but in increments. A worn glove found and mended, a bunk swept clean, a pair of work boots that almost fit. The chief kept his promises in small, precise ways. He didn't hand out patience like a sermon, he measured it. He left a pair of old but usable gloves in a locker and a thermos of coffee on the bench. He didn't make speeches. He adjusted the schedule enough that the boy's presence didn't look like a favor, but like part of the routine. A man who administrated bolts also administrated dignity. He learned to do both. But not everyone found the sudden change easy to hold. Marco, who'd been loudest in his doubts, watched the boy with narrowed eyes, the way you watch an unfamiliar dog at the edge of your field. The city's new manager, who came by once a week to check spreadsheets, frowned at the shuffling of the schedule. "If this drains time," she said without looking at anyone, "we have to cut losses." The chief met her gaze and for the first time in his life understood the difference between being right and being practical. Being practical had gotten the yard its contracts. Being right had kept him up at night, remembering things he'd lost. "We'll track hours," he promised. "No wasted time. It's an apprenticeship. It could pay off." She left, unconvinced. That was her job. The apprentices shrugged and went back to work. The city's sensibilities remained. The boy came every morning. He arrived with a small canvas bag and the same crumpled sandwich in his pocket more often than not. He learned quickly, the way sharp minds learn under watchful eyes. He learned the rhythm of measuring, the patience of leaving a bolt in place until the metal relaxed. The chief taught him to reach for a ratchet instead of a coat hanger. The boy taught the chief to look at a part and imagine how it might be coaxed rather than replaced. The change was not dramatic. It wasn't a montage of problem-free successes. It was a slow accretion, a piece freed here, a stubborn bolt turned there. The bus's back axle eased enough to turn on a jack. A rubber boot replaced with a scrounged piece of better-fit rubber the boy had found in a heap and claimed like treasure. Each victory was small and cost something: an hour's wage, the chief's pride, a few blank stares from the manager. But the bus moved closer toward being a bus again. It grew louder in the yard, like a rumor that wouldn't be quieted. Between jobs, the boy talked sometimes. He kept a small photograph folded inside his jacket, two people beside a bicycle laughing. He pointed to it once and said, "My aunt. She taught me to look after things." "Where is she now?" the chief asked, awkward with the direction of his own curiosity. "She's not here," the boy said, and the words didn't ask for pity. They were factual, like a note in a ledger. The chief didn't pry. He had learned to respect silence.
He'd also learned over years of oil and cold mornings that people refract pain differently. Some built fences, some built tools. The boy built a toolkit of both. As the bus began to reveal its own potential, others saw it too. Little things shifted in the shop. Coffee cups were left for a new hand. Rags that used to be thrown into a heap were folded. An apprentice who had been training to be cynical found himself asking the boy how he'd made a wheel hub hold when all the textbooks said it wouldn't. The answer was always the same: small, practical choices made again and again. The chief began writing things down in a way he never had before. He made a small stack of hours in a ledger, and once he signed for the boy's first pair of work boots with a grimace, as if signing cost him more than just money. He never called it charity, he called it investment. Words matter like that. They make decisions feel like work instead of pity. And yet, inside him, the old man who liked to be right had not gone away. He still bristled at the idea that this youth had taught him anything. He was not, after all, one to be humbled without protest. Late one night, when the bay was empty and the bus's silhouette was a ghost against sodium lamps, he stood by the tarpaulin and ran a hand over the frame. His fingers found the dent where the bus had been hit on the west side years ago. He remembered a driver who'd once hidden his fear behind a laugh. He thought of the sticker, Route 21, and imagined the people who rode to work on that bus when it had been alive. It was then the chief noticed something he hadn't before. The boy's tools were not only practical, some were created from scraps. A half-broken wrench had been salvaged and welded. A spring had been tightened and used as a clamp. It took a craftsman's eye to see borrowed ingenuity as art. The chief, who had spent a lifetime preferring the right-sized socket, felt a small, slow admiration that shook like a tremor under his ribs. There were tensions. Supplies were limited. The city's accounting office called once to press for parts invoices. Marco grumbled in the background about liability if the bus made it back onto the road and failed. The manager, who had wrapped herself in spreadsheets, asked for a timeline. The chief gave one, at least, an answer that admitted unknowns and committed to effort. The boy kept working as if each day was another chip to hammer off a boulder.
He kept showing up before the others, often in a jacket that had patches from a dozen different winters. He kept his small rituals. He tied the bandana a little tighter when he expected rain. He kept his sandwich safe like a relic. He would walk home at dusk sometimes with grease on his knuckles and a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with the chief's praise. One morning, when the sky had the thin blue of late autumn, the boy found a small metal plate in the shop, ornamental, scratched, a name that time had rubbed away.
He held it up like a secret, and then he and the chief decided, without much deliberation, to bolt it into the bus's dash. It was an act that had no financial value and everything to do with storytelling. The chief almost laughed aloud at his own sentimentality, then set to improvising a place for it. "Names matter," the chief said when the plate was in place. He didn't say which names. He didn't need to. The bus, now stitched and coaxed, would carry people again one day. Small things were being put into order. That afternoon, the city inspector came by unannounced. He poked and prodded the bus with the professional coldness of a man who looked at mechanics as variables in a spreadsheet. He frowned at improvised parts and made notes into a black leather book. The chief waited, palms tucked into his jacket pockets like a man holding a secret not yet ready to be revealed. "You're making progress," the inspector said finally, less a compliment than a recognition that effort had been made. "But you'll need certified parts for the axle. We can't let it on the road without those." The chief nodded. "Understood. We can make it safe. We'll get the parts by next month if the council greenlights the expense." The inspector scribbled, turned, and left with the briskness of duty fulfilled. The youth who had helped had learned to accept a conditional victory. The bus might be saved, but only if the city agreed to invest. Saving was a collaborative word. When the crew left for the day, the workshop held its breath in that dusk-silenced way. The chief stayed. He lit a cigarette, which he had not done in years, more for the ritual than the nicotine. He smoked for a while, looking at the bus, at the plate they had bolted in, at the boy's small bag leaning against a crate. He thought about his own life in the yard, a string of machines half-lived and whole, of nights spent thinking about balance sheets and a stubborn desire to fix. He had not expected that the thing he'd sworn was beyond saving would end up saving him in some small moral way. The boy walked up as the chief stubbed out his cigarette. He had picked up the tools left out, washed his hands in a basin, and carried his sandwich with a sort of gravity he had not allowed himself before, like a thing he guarded because it mattered. "You get home?" the chief asked. The question was ordinary, a vessel that could hold anything. "It's fine," the boy said. "There's a woman, Mrs. Elena. She lets me keep a blanket in her shed. She says she'll tell me when I've earned a bed." The chief grunted acknowledgement. Details like that mattered more than any city ordinance. They were the scaffolding of dignity. He surprised himself with an offer he'd rehearsed 100 ways but never thought to actually give. "We're not charity," he said, voice blunt as the socket ratchet. "But if you keep showing, we can give you something steady. Not a miracle, a job, apprenticeship. If it goes well, maybe more." The boy's eyes did not water, which the chief considered a success in itself. They flickered with something like relief and calculation, a mixture of hope and the sensible budgeting of it. "That's enough for me," the boy said quietly. He licked his thumb and wiped a smudge of grease from his knuckle, the motion like a small covenant. "I'll be here at 6. The chief watched him go, his figure folding into the street's gray. He had no illusions. The boy's arrival would not fix every brokenness in the yard or in him. The manager would still call for reports. Marco would still mutter about liabilities. The city would still balance its appetite for numbers against the value of stubborn things. But a small ledger had been opened between the two, a promise penned not in ink but in hours. That promise made the yard feel like it had less room for excuses. It required work and patience. It required the chief to be accountable not only to machines, but to a person who could be overlooked and misread at the drop of a hat. It required the crew to stretch empathy into their otherwise rigid routines. Night settled. The tarpaulin stilled over the bus like a blanket. The chief locked the gate and walked past the place where the boy had rested his bag. He paused and, without thinking, picked up a small bolt the boy had used as a makeshift wedge earlier. He held it up to the fading light. It was scuffed and ugly and somehow valuable now. He dropped it into his pocket. Tomorrow would ask more of them. It would ask for parts and time and a patience that doesn't come naturally to ledger-bound men. But for now there was a small warmth in the chief's chest, the kind that comes from having been surprised by a young hand that knew the right tap. In the quiet, the yard felt like it had been offered a choice: write the bus off or write a different story. The chief had chosen, with a stigma of stubbornness and a sprinkle of humility, to keep the narrative open. If this kind of story moves you, of people showing up and small things turning into greater changes, subscribe and stick around. There are more mornings to come. The second morning arrived with frost on the benches and a sun that felt thin through the city's haze. The boy came in early with sleeves dusted in sleep. He had the same bag, the same sandwich, only now the sandwich sat in cloth and not in paper, as if someone had thought a little more about protection. They started with small tasks: cleaning corroded bolts, measuring gaps, noting which parts could be reused and which would need ordering. The chief taught him to catalog, to measure twice and cut never. The boy taught the chief to listen to the routes a bus took through a city, to imagine the lives inside them. It was an odd, slow exchange. By midweek, the bus's engine would turn over more willingly than before. The chief grinned occasionally at small successes, then swore softly when an expected part failed.
There were moments of pure craft, fitting a reluctant bearing with a hand press, coaxing a reluctant valve into respect. The boy reveled in those moments the way someone revels in a secret victory. But the work was thinly funded. The city's finance office delayed payments. The manager requested an expense report. The chief, who had never liked paperwork, found himself writing down hours and part numbers and reasons. The boy watched and learned the small negotiations that kept a yard running. One night, after a stretched day of progress and the kind of exhaustion that made conversation unnecessary, the chief found himself at the small bench where the boy had left a set of clean tools. There were rags folded neatly, a pair of gloves turned inside out to dry. A small photograph lay face down by a bench light. The chief picked it up, as one might pick up a relic, and turned it over. In the picture, two people, older than the boy, sat on a stoop, smiling like they had all the time in the world and was spending it wisely. On the back, in a shaky script, a name: Aunt Elena. The chief put the photograph back where he'd found it, with care. He had not meant to intrude, but hands remember how to look after things, even when the things are other people's memories. There was a call from the manager that night, a short, official string of words asking for a justification of hours. He typed an answer that was as honest as he could make it: a list of tasks, a schedule, a budget proposal. At the end, he added a line he almost erased: "The boy has been instrumental in making progress." It was a soft declaration with the force of a small revolution. He pressed send and felt a pang of something like fear and something like release. Not everyone celebrated. Marco still hung back sometimes, his face a map of guardedness. He watched the boy's hands and sometimes found himself offering help without meaning to, passing a socket or showing the right way to hold a ratchet, then pulling away as if embarrassed by his own indulgence.
Small acts like that, passing along an old trick, leaving an extra sandwich in a lunchbox, began to act like a slow tide on the crew's hardened shores. The bus moved. It did not glide back to life like a miracle made of fairy dust. It responded to patience and persistence. The chief learned to allow for slow victories, and in allowing them, recognized his own stubborn smallness. He had called the machine beyond saving because it fit the facts and spared him the messy work of trying. Having someone insist otherwise, someone who held nothing by way of title and held everything by way of grit, made his own defenses feel tired and unnecessary. One afternoon, a neighbor from the community center walked by and stopped to watch the bus being coaxed. She carried a clipboard stuffed with leaflets and the sort of hope that isn't glossy but persistent. Her name was Mara, and she ran a food program on Wednesdays.
She had known the bus when it still ran Route 21, and the sight of it being brought back made something like a bright ache in her chest. "If you make that roadworthy," she said, "I'll take it on Wednesdays to bring food to the east side. We've been using borrowed vans. A bus like that could carry more than cans, could carry a message that someone cares." The chief looked at Mara, then at the boy. An idea settled between them. A bus that once served the city could now serve again in a different way. The thought of repurposing the machine for community work felt like a fitting conclusion to the labor of coaxing life back into battered metal. But then reality intervened with its ledger. The city required certified parts for safety. The finance office wanted cost-benefit analysis. The bus's frame needed work that required money the shop did not have on hand. "We can try," the chief said carefully, "but this is contingent on approval. It's not charity to make promises I can't keep." Mara nodded. Her face was practical and kind. "We'll help raise funds," she said. "People will volunteer. Stories like this move people." Stories move people because they allow others to imagine themselves in different arrangements. This one had the texture of truth, a machine written off, revived by human persistence, a boy who knew how to coax things into life, a chief whose pride softened into responsibility. As the week waned, the boy began to assemble a small toolkit of his own, tools the chief had approved of and tools the boy had fashioned. He kept the photograph of Aunt Elena in the corner of his workbench, and sometimes the chief would catch him talking to it, not out loud, but in the practiced murmur of someone who tells themselves stories to keep going. They had a partial victory. The engine turned over reliably now, and mobility, slow and careful, had returned to the bus. They could roll it within the yard, jostle it into a bay for inspection. It was progress not certified by any city bell, but felt genuine to those who had worked for it. And yet, at the edge of that progress, the chief felt the tug of something larger than a machine. The boy had taught him to look at things differently, to consider the value of small persistence, to see that people left at the margins carried knowledge as well as need. He learned that being saved is not always a question of one person giving another life, but that lives are saved when people are seen and given a place to exert their competence. They were not done. The bus still required parts the city must approve. Marco still had reservations about liability and discipline. The manager would call for an official timeline, and the boy's place in the yard would have to survive scrutiny. The chief understood that the real repairs were not just to engines, but to the routines that decide who is given a chance. On a chilly morning toward the end of that first month, as the crew gathered for a safety briefing, the chief cleared his throat. He did not make a speech. Instead, he walked to the notice board, pulled down a blank form, and pinned up a small note. "Volunteer apprenticeship hours. Apply here." It was not written in big letters. It was a simple step, a document that signaled a structured chance instead of an ad hoc favor. It said to anyone who was watching that the yard might consider looking at people differently. The boy noticed the note and grinned, surprised at the officialness of the gesture. He tapped the paper with a finger that had learned to measure things accurately. The chief nodded once. He did not celebrate. He simply continued with work, because celebration without follow-through felt like a lie. Yet that moment echoed, a small public act that had the potential to change the way the crew saw the boy and others like him. It also invited new questions about who deserved consideration. The yard kept moving, and with every turn of the ratchet and every smudge of grease, the story unfolded. The boy learned to log hours. The chief learned to justify them. Marco kept his distance, but less intensely. Mara held meetings with the community. The bus waited like a patient creature, half restored and ready for its next use. It was in such a place, partway between the certainty of the wrecking yard and the possibility of something else, that a new complication arrived. The city's transport inspector called in a demand form from the council. Before any vehicle is repurposed for community use, it must pass a safety audit that included parts certified by a supplier who worked exclusively with approved vendors. The list was long, and the cost, suddenly, was not small. The chief read the notice alone in the office that smelled of oil and old paper. The word certified drummed into his head like a metronome. He could feel the ledger's weight on his shoulders again. He could choose to retract the offer and put the bus back on the scrap list, justify it with budgets and liability. Or he could find a way. He thought of the boy out in the yard fitting a bearing with patient craft. He thought of Mara at the community center smiling with a kind of relief that had nothing to do with accounting. He thought, too, of the small plate he'd bolted into the dash. Names were stubborn things. He found himself looking at the ledger differently. Maybe there was a place in the figures where a human investment could be counted as value, even if it didn't fit neatly into a spreadsheet. That night, the chief set down his screwdriver and did something that made his hands tremble. Not because the act was dangerous, but because it was unfamiliar. He called a meeting with his crew and the manager, and he did, in a plain voice, what men are reluctant to do. He laid out the numbers and the vision. He asked for help.
It was the first time he'd asked the shop to collaborate in anything since he'd taken the chief's jacket. There were groans. There was a quiet rebellion in the way people want to keep profit and purpose as separate things. But after the grumbling, there were suggestions. Small fundraising ideas from the community center, donations of parts from a sympathetic supplier, a volunteer trade from one of the apprentices at a nearby technical school who would trade labor for credits. The chief felt the shop shift, not in a single great sweep, but in the cumulative nudging of many small hands. He had been right about one thing. The yard was not a place for idle hope. It was a place for people to do the work of hope. They did it with toolboxes, spare parts rolled in like a slow wave of turning points, and a steady commitment to not erase the boy's agency by pretending the world had suddenly turned nicer. On the morning they rolled the bus into the inspection bay for the official audit, the boy stood on a crate and peered in at the engine like someone looking at a friend after a long illness. He had a smudge of oil on his cheek and a confidence that had been paid for by long hours. The chief stood behind him, hands in pockets, watching with a guarded pride he refused to flaunt. The inspector walked around, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp. He prodded, rattled, and asked for certified documents. The crew presented what they had: receipts, sponsored parts, volunteer logs, an assembled packet of repairs. The inspector frowned and looked over their paperwork and over the bus. At the end, he set down his pen. "This is not standard procedure," he said, "but I'm impressed by the thoroughness of your work. I'm sending this to the council with a recommendation. No guarantees, but it's a start." That was the closest thing to an official nod the yard had yet received. Not a miracle, not a clearance. The inspector's pen closed with the soft click of someone who had just shifted a weight and decided to carry it a little farther. That recommendation, small, bureaucratic, but moving, became the hinge on which the next days swung. It bought them time, and time was a kind of currency the yard had not had in months.
The council asked for a presentation, and the chief, who liked to let bolts do most of his speaking, found himself drafting a short speech. He worked at it like any repair, removed the rust of unnecessary words, fit the idea to the frame of practical facts, and tightened until it held. He wrote about hours logged, parts salvaged, volunteer labor, and the proposal to repurpose the bus for community deliveries. He did not write in so many words about the boy who had shown him the hidden hinge, but he left room for a line, an honest, human line, because he had learned that numbers without faces were often easier to ignore. Before the council hearing, Mara and her volunteers organized the small fundraiser at the community center.
She brought casseroles and a poster bearing a faded photo of Route 21 in its better years. People who remembered the bus when it used to ferry grandmothers to markets and boys to school came with loose change and stronger pledges. There were children selling lemonade and a retired driver who offered his time to scrub the inside of the bus when funds allowed. Someone donated a crate of certified bolts from a supplier who read about the project online and decided that some investments didn't need a return as long as they made a difference. Marco watched all of it with an expression that softened at the edges. He had not signed petition forms or sung at fundraisers. He watched instead the way people came in and left with their hands a little cleaner than when they arrived. He passed along a box of gloves to a volunteer without announcing the generosity. He still grumbled, professionally, habitually, but the frequency of his grumbles thinned like oil clinging to a well-loved wrench. The council meeting was the kind of civic theater the chief had avoided for years, a room full of faces that looked like responsibility itself. He stood before them with the inspection packet and the volunteer logs, and Mara by his side to speak to the neighborhood voice the packet could not contain. He kept his remarks short and factual. Mara spoke of distribution routes that could reach food deserts, of schedules that meant the difference between a warm meal and an empty evening for several blocks. She spoke with a steady economy of words that made the chief admire the way she could lay need and dignity on the table without making them indistinguishable. When the councilman asked about liability and certification, the chief presented the plan they had cobbled together. Certified parts to be purchased with a small municipal grant, volunteer labor for non-critical work, a time frame for procurement, and an agreement with a union driver to operate community runs until one of their apprentices received licensing. It wasn't a grand bargain, it was a practical one. He made it clear this was not a plea for sentiment, but a proposal for action. There were questions, always were, and one councilwoman, older and with a soft voice, asked why the city should spend money on an old bus when it could buy 2 newer vans. The chief answered, plainly, that a bus carried more than people. It carried a story. It carried the memory of routes once run and the convenience necessary to build new ones. It was cheaper than 2 vans once they tallied volunteer labor and in-kind donations. It would function as a mobile hub the city did not currently have. The vote came down to degrees of willingness. The council approved a modest grant, enough to buy the certified parts they could not legally bypass, and it authorized a pilot program to use the bus for community deliveries on weekends. It was not a categorical endorsement of the chief's sentimentalities, but it was a step, enough to wrench the machine out of the scrap pile and set it toward purpose. Back at the yard, there was a sense of ceremony without trumpets. The supplier, who had pledged bolts and a warranty, dropped off a pallet, and the apprentices, who had been taking lecture-style classes on paperwork, suddenly had a living lesson in how promises were kept. The chief signed receipts with a hand that was steadier than he felt. He felt, more than ever, the precariousness of the whole arrangement, the bus's fate balanced on a ledger and a council vote and the goodwill of strangers. Yet there was room now for action. The boy, Miguel, as he allowed the chief to call him after a month of work that had earned the name, moved easily into this next phase. He learned how to read certification lists and to cross-reference part numbers.
He learned the clinical language of compliance and the poetic stubbornness of craftsmen, the difference between something that met regulation and something that moved. He remained practical in his expectations. When people offered him pity masked as concern, he deflected it with the same economy he used with tools. "I'll trade you 5 hours of work for 1 driver's lesson," he joked once, and the chief found himself both laughing and calculating how to make that trade happen. Formalizing the apprenticeship required a piece of paper, signatures, and the manager's cautious approval. The chief filled out the necessary forms and then sat with Miguel across a metal table in an office that smelled of old coffee and new decisions. He explained, slowly, that this would be a payroll apprenticeship, that there would be rules about attendance and a probationary period, and that the yard would provide training. Miguel listened, nodding like someone understanding both the freedom and the constraint of contracts. "Will I get paid?" he asked simply. "You will," the chief said. His tone made it clear he intended to keep that promise. There were small obstacles. The manager wanted a background check and proof of address. Miguel produced a reference letter from Mrs. Elena and his hours logged in the yard. He had no fixed address, but Mrs. Elena's cottage sufficed as a temporary contact. The paperwork went through with signatures that made the arrangement feel official and not charity. Miguel signed his name with a firm hand. For the first time in a long while, someone had written his name as part of a system that promised structure. Marco watched the signatures and let a corner of his mouth lift. He did not congratulate loudly. He did not have to. The glove he left on Miguel's bench the next morning was an unspoken admission, an acknowledgment that hands could change. The manager, pragmatic and careful, set conditions. Miguel would not be allowed to operate vehicles until properly licensed. He would be supervised on road work.
The yard would track hours and provide training modules at the nearby technical school. It was a plan that placed guardrails around hope, intentional, not punitive. Repairs ensued, with the bus gradually shedding the makeshift solutions of earlier days in favor of certified components. The supplier's bolts arrived with a note encouraging discretion, and a retired union mechanic volunteered to install critical parts. The apprentices filed through like a small army of focused energy, learning under those who had the most calluses and the quietest laughter. The day the certified parts were bolted in and the bus rolled into the authorized inspection bay for the second time, there was a different kind of hush. This one was less nervous and more taut with anticipation. The crew tightened connections, checked seals, and cleaned grease from faces with the same deliberate care they used on high-stakes procedures. The inspector came with a different clerk this time and flicked his flashlight like someone who reads metal the way others read books. He ran his diagnostics and looked over the paper trail assembled like evidence of diligence. At the end of the day, he nodded. "It meets the standards," he said, which in the yard's language meant a quiet official permission to proceed. There were no headlines, no ecstatic fanfare, but the sound of the bus's engine turning over cleanly felt like confirmation. It moved with a healthier, steadier voice. It would carry passengers again, under terms that meant safety. On the first official run, Mara organized volunteers to stock the bus with crates of produce and boxes of shelf-stable goods. The driver was a union member who had volunteered his weekend for the program, and Miguel rode as the assistant mechanic and route coordinator. He checked straps, secured boxes, and learned how to account for schedules. He did not drive that day. Instead, he watched the city unfold from the bus's door and learned the choreography of stops and distribution. They rolled down old Route 21 and stopped at 3 neighborhoods. At the first stop, an elderly woman waited with a cart and a smile that made her eyes warm.
She took a box and hugged it like a prize, and without thinking, hugged Miguel's grease-streaked sleeve. His face became something like a map of surprise and modest pride. At the second stop, a small boy handed him a drawn card of thanks that said, in crooked letters, "You saved our food." Miguel tucked it into his pocket as if it were a talisman. At the third stop, a man who had once been a bus driver but now volunteered as an organizer slid his hand into Miguel's and shook it hard. The handshake felt like a transfer of trust. The yard watched the photos Mara took, snapshots of the distribution days, pinned up on the break room corkboard. They were not framed in gold. They were practical, honest pictures. A crate of tomatoes, volunteers passing cans, a child with flour on his face.
Marco stood by the board one afternoon and, seeing the images of the bus on the move, found himself telling someone an anecdote about a broken clutch he'd once fixed in an alley. He told it without ceremony, but his listeners laughed, and in the telling his voice grew softer. The machine had become a visible vessel for the changes taking place, but it was not the machine alone that mattered. It was what the machine enabled: new routines of care, steady employment for Miguel, a mechanism by which neighborhood need met organized distribution. The yard's notice board grew more populated with small morning schedules and volunteer rosters. People who had once shuffled past the gate lingered and contributed nails, a paint can, time. Within the workshop, habits shifted incrementally. The chief, who had always given orders with the economy of someone who believed in decisive action, began to ask questions. "How'd you secure that clamp?" he would say, not to test, but to learn. He sat with Miguel on more than one evening, chewing the same bread and talking of the day's challenges. When the boy returned home to Mrs. Elena's shed in the evenings, he found his bunk cleaned and a thermos left by someone who had noticed his sleeplessness and decided to do something human about it. The practical costs, overtime, paperwork, and the occasional supply snafu remained real. There were moments of friction. The city's bureaucracy had its own slow rhythms and sometimes delayed payments. The manager still checked hours with a hawk's eye. Marco still worried once in a while aloud about liability. Those moments mattered because they reminded everyone that empathy without work is an idea, not a structure. And because the project involved so many hands, the boy's success did not rest entirely on the chief's shoulders. The technical school certified one of the apprentices with a special acknowledgement and offered a discount for Miguel's eventual driver training. A supplier extended credit against community sponsorships, and a retired driver agreed to mentor Miguel through the hours needed for licensure. It was a mosaic of support, small contributions that, when assembled, formed a sustainable pathway. A symbolic moment arrived during a modest gathering Mara organized, a small potluck in the yard to mark the bus's first month of community service. There were no speeches longer than a minute, no plaques with too many official signatures, just a circle of people passing plates and folding their hands around warm bread. The chief stood near the engine bay and listened to a neighbor who spoke of the difference it made to have a regular distribution. The neighbor's gratitude was not dramatic, it was quiet and steady, a testament to cumulative help. Afterward, the chief found a pocket of quiet and took something from his jacket. It was the little bolt he had picked up months ago when the boy first stayed at the yard. It looked ordinary, scratched, carried with fingerprints. He walked over to Miguel's bench, where a neat set of tools had been arranged like a ritual. Miguel looked up, surprised at the intensity in the chief's eyes. "I kept this," the chief said, and he handed the bolt to Miguel. "You used it well." Miguel turned the bolt in his hand. It sat comfortably there like something properly earned. He expected perhaps a pat on the shoulder. Instead, the chief clapped him on the back, and in that gesture confirmed a small transfer, the bolt for a place, the place for recognition. Miguel did not speak much. He smiled, a contained delight that did not demand or expect anything more. They finished the evening by bolting in a small plaque the boy and the chief had designed together. It read simply, Route 21, served by many hands. It was not extravagant. It was a public record that the bus's life was not merely mechanical, but a shared story. They bolted it on the interior dash where the old plate had been. The chief's hands worked steady, but his mind stayed slightly elsewhere, on the measure of small promises kept and the daily cost of doing right. Not everyone applauded. The board in the city office still had skeptics, and an op-ed appeared in a paper arguing that the city should invest in scalable infrastructure rather than sentimental projects. The chief read it aloud one morning and then folded the paper and placed it in a drawer. He did not have to answer every critic. The work itself answered better than any rebuttal. He had learned by then that you convince the skeptical not through lecture, but by systematic competence and tidy books. As months passed, the apprenticeship became a slow arc rather than a single line. Miguel took evening classes that taught him the theory behind the motions he'd learned by necessity. He stayed late to read wiring diagrams and practiced operating small hydraulic pumps under supervision. The driver mentor took him on passenger safety checks, a humanities of driving course disguised as a safety tutorial. He logged hours that would one day lead to licensing. He kept saving a small portion of his paycheck, measured and modest, which he deposited into a small envelope hidden in his locker, a ritual of self-sufficiency. The yard, too, transformed. The break room that had once held a perpetual impatience now had a shelf for donated non-perishables with a sign that read, "Take if you need, leave if you can." An apprentice who had once rolled his eyes at displays of softness began bringing extra sandwiches for those who came by early. Marco, in his way, learned to nod and hand over the right-sized socket without being asked, an economical kindness that cost him nothing but time and gave others everything. The bus, repurposed, did more than deliver groceries. It became a moving notice board, a place where job postings were folded into bags handed to riders. It transported not only food, but information about workshops, healthcare visits, registration drives.
The city's logistics team, initially skeptical, started using the bus's route data to optimize distribution in other neighborhoods. What had started as an improvised rescue became a proven model for modest civic repair. Yet the story never pretended that the solution was complete. Miguel still faced nights where the shed at Mrs. Elena's was insufficient shelter, a fact the chief knew and helped with by negotiating a small stipend that allowed for a community bed program when needed. There were days when the yard ran low on parts, and the chief gritted his teeth and negotiated credit. There were bureaucrats who asked for perfect columns when life is inherently ragged. The real change wasn't a tidy ending. It was the accumulation of many modest repairs that added up to a new normal. Toward the end of one long year, the city invited a few community leaders and volunteers to a small ceremony to mark the bus's first year back in operation in its new role. There were a few brief remarks. The union driver spoke about the value of community. Mara spoke of neighborhoods reconnected, and a council member thanked the yard for their adaptive approach. The chief, who had learned to limit his words, stepped up and spoke, briefly, plainly. "We didn't save a bus. We put a tool back where it belongs. The bus did its job. More importantly, people did what they do when given a chance to be useful." He did not indulge in grand metaphors. He did not transform his earlier words into a sermon. He told the truth as he had learned to tell it, practical and humble. After the talk, people came by to thank Miguel, and he accepted gratitude with the modesty of someone who had always been transactional about kindness. Give work, get dignity. There was one image that summed the changes better than any speech could. On the yard's notice board, amid the timesheets and safety memos, someone had pinned a photo, Miguel standing in front of the bus on a bright morning, holding a crate of tomatoes.
The chief had placed next to it a small handwritten note. "We were wrong." The note was not dramatic. It was a quiet confession and a record of altered judgment. People read the note and smiled. Children liked it because it was short. Grown men liked it because it admitted a vulnerability never before confessed in the yard. The chief had written it in a hasty hand, the letters uneven like rivets, but it expressed something deep, a recognition that an absolute verdict, "This is beyond saving," was easier to pronounce than to resist. One afternoon, after the ceremony, the chief walked to the tarpaulin where the bus had been born anew. He lifted the edge and ran his hand along a seam that had once been stubbornly fused. The metal now gave a respectful squeak under his fingers. He thought of the boy who had first offered half a sandwich and a pointed suggestion about a hinge, and he felt the old substrate of the yard's work rearrange under his skin.
Miguel came up behind him with 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to the chief without fanfare. The chief accepted, and for a moment they stood in silence, looking at the machine that had been the axis of so many small revolutions. "You ever think you might have called it wrong?" Miguel asked quietly, and the question was less an accusation than a way of measuring change. The chief looked at him. For once he found that words felt less necessary than the evidence of a life in progress. "I did," he said, then added with a rough sort of humor, "but I like being wrong about good things." Miguel laughed, the sound clear and young. He wiped his hands on his jeans, and then, because the yard had become a place where symbolic acts mattered, he pulled from his toolbox a small repaired wrench, one that had been given to him months ago, welded, and began to play the role of a proper tool. He handed it to the chief. "For you," he said, "so you remember the first one who convinced you." The chief accepted the wrench and felt the balance of it as if it were more than metal. He turned it over in his palm, and then, with the ceremonious clumsiness that fitted him, handed it back. "Keep it," he said. "You earned it." Miguel pretended to object and then slid the wrench into his box. The chief tapped the bench with a knuckle and then placed his own hand on Miguel's shoulder briefly, an unfamiliar gesture for a man of his economy, but it carried all the drafts they had weathered together. As the sun lowered, painting the tarpaulin in a tired gold, they walked to the notice board and carefully pinned a new photo beside the old, the bus in motion, volunteers unloading crates, a goofy smile caught in the camera between the chief and Miguel. The plaque in the dash had become a memory of the plate they'd bolted together. The bolt the chief kept in his pocket, a relic of humility and kinship. By then, the line that had started the whole upheaval sat like a story told in the margins of a notebook. "This machine is beyond saving," had been the thread that knotted the early urgency of the chief's certainty. It had been a true statement in context, facts about costs, frames, and time, but its final force lay in what happened next. People had shown up, parts had been found, volunteers had rallied, and a boy had woven practical skill into the lives of men who had once stopped learning from anyone without a title. If anyone asked the chief now whether the machine had been beyond saving, he would smile in a way that admitted the complicated truth of living. Some things are beyond saving if we do not care to try. They are not beyond repair when a community chooses to invest in them, in material and time and patience. And sometimes, he thought, as he looked at Miguel and then at the bus, the people who seem to need the most from the world have the quietest lessons to give. The yard's routine did not end in one tidy morning.